This is the section from Chapter 4, Section 2, and the topic is price floors and price ceilings, otherwise known as price controls. So far we've been analyzing markets, and we've been assuming that buyers are free to offer any price they want, and sellers are free also to offer any price that they want to sell at. But in some markets, buyers and sellers aren't free to offer prices. Governments control the prices. And so we'll be looking at examples, for example, like rent control. In some cities, like San Francisco and Berkeley, landlords are not free to ask whatever they want, right? To charge whatever they want. Minimum wage laws are also price controls because firms are not allowed to pay whatever they want, right? They have to pay above the minimum wage. And there are other examples as well. The first example in the book is about agricultural price floors. In my opinion, this is not the best example of a price floor. Why? Because a price floor, in the strictest sense of the word, the government says, okay, here's the price floor. It's above the equilibrium price, and it's illegal for anyone to pay a price less than the floor. But in fact, what tends to happen in agriculture is something like the following. The government says, okay, we want farmers to get this price. But at this price, we know there's going to be a surplus. So what we'll do is we'll buy up the surplus. Essentially, that's better modeled as increasing demand. So really the important aspect of this Chapter 4, Applications of Demand and Supply, is understanding how to model various situations with the demand and supply framework. And so the textbook is using price controls to illustrate agricultural price supports. I think there's probably a better example. The better example that I would like to use is just labor markets. So here we have demand and supply for, let's say, unskilled labor. So this is the quantity. This could be, for example, hours of work. And then here we have the price. What is the price of labor? What's that known as in everyday language? A wage. Usually paid by the hour, right? So if we had an unregulated market, and of course there's many types of labor, right? There are brain surgeons and there are ditch diggers. So let's think about this as being closer to the ditch digger example, right? Unskilled labor. Here's the equilibrium price, and that might be like, say, $5. And the quantity demanded would be around maybe, who knows, 100 hours. But what's going to happen is some of the ditch diggers or the unskilled labor and other people who care about them will say, look, $5 per hour is not enough to live on, right? It's not a living wage. By the way, living wage is not a term economists usually use, but you do hear it sometimes. So in other words, it's not high enough, right? So what do people propose to do? Impose a minimum wage. Is a minimum wage a price ceiling or a price floor? It's a floor, because you can't go below it, right? That's how I think about price floors. Price ceilings is you can't go above it. So nobody's saying you can't pay ditch diggers more than this, right? They're saying you can't pay them less than this. So it's a price floor. And sometimes I like to draw this with a little hook on the end. So for example, like this. So let's say we want to make the wage $8 an hour. I put a little hook on the end like this, just to emphasize that this is a floor. We can't go below it. Okay, so what do we see about now the quantity supplied? Roughly, what would the quantity supplied, what happened to it? It increased, right? Because at a price of $8, the price intersects the supply curve here, and so we see that around 150 ditch diggers want to work, right? But, in other words, we moved along the supply curve from here to here once the wage increased. But what happened to the demand for ditch diggers? It fell, right? And remember, in this market, firms are demanders, right? They're the ones who hire the workers, and households are the suppliers. It's reverse from the PC market and other markets that we've considered. Firms reduce the quantity demanded. So maybe we go from 100 to 50. So what's this called? Right, there's a surplus of unskilled labor now. Are the ditch diggers better off? Some of them, right? Because we see that 50 are employed now, right? You have a quantity supplied of 150 and a quantity demanded of 50. So what will be the quantity exchanged? It's going to be the lesser of the two, right? Imagine it this way. You have 150 people who want to work, and then you have 50 people who want to hire them. So only 50 are going to be hired, right? So 50 people have a job. Before, 100 people had a job. So in other words, 50 people lost their job. So if you lost your job, you're not better off. But if you kept your job, you are better off because now you're making $8, which is better than $5, right? So this illustrates one of the unintended consequences of the minimum wage laws that thinking about the world through the lens of models helps us to see. In other words, the unintended consequence of minimum wage laws is to cause unemployment. Yeah.
So quality would not be hourly, it would be number of workers.
Yeah, okay, I updated my example, right. So we could talk about number of jobs or hours. Yeah, good point. Sometimes I'm a little sloppy, so thanks for catching me there. But this is a good example of a price floor. Now, notice if we have a price floor that is below equilibrium, so let me redraw this. Say we put the price floor here, what's going to happen? It will just stay at equilibrium, right? Because remember, it's a floor. It says we can't go below it. Well, here at the equilibrium, we're not below it anyway. So this would be like, if the equilibrium wage was $5, it would be like saying, okay, you can't pay people less than $3. Okay, no one's getting paid $3 anyway, so this is called a non-binding price floor. What about rent ceilings? Price ceilings. A common example that we use to illustrate price ceilings is rent control. And here you have a figure illustrating a binding rent control. There are other types of rent ceilings, but rent control is a good example. And so if the equilibrium is here, some people will be worried that it's too high, right? This is unaffordable housing. So what do people propose to do sometimes? Put rent control in. So the rent can't be higher than this lower level PC. But what do we notice? First of all, landlords supply a smaller quantity. That makes sense, right? If the rent is going to go down, think of a landlord saying, look, I have this building. I can make it an office building or I can make it an apartment building. If now the rent is lower, they're more likely to make it an office building, right? So they might take some buildings and convert them from apartments to offices. Right? At the same time, more people want to get these units, right, because they're cheaper. So you have a shortage. Before, we had, say, at this equilibrium, 100 apartments rented per period. But now that there's a rent control, and we would put this, I would put a little hook here to illustrate that it's a price ceiling. Maybe we have 125 units demanded, but only 75 supplied. So are renters better off with rent control? Some of them are, right? Because before 100 people had apartments, now only 75 have apartments. So if you lost your apartment, you're worse off now. If your apartment got converted from an apartment building to office building, you're worse off now. But if you got to keep your apartment, you're better off because you're paying a lower price, right? And so this is what's called a shortage, because we have a quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. One question that is not answered by the supply and demand model is, who decides which of these 125 people get one of the 75 units? So markets use various rationing mechanisms. And it can't be price, at least legally, right? So you can't say, look, I'll give this apartment to whoever's willing to pay the most. You can't do that, because you can't pay more than this rent control. So how do you think the landlords decide? Yeah.
Well, some of them could like have personal connections or give them to the person.
Right. Maybe you have an uncle who's a landlord, right? In some cities, like in San Francisco, I was talking about the agricultural market isn't exactly a perfect market to illustrate price controls. San Francisco's method of rent control also isn't perfect because they don't control the rent, but what they do is they control the increase. So in San Francisco, if you live in a rent-controlled building, your landlord can't increase the price more than like 1 or 2% per year. And so in that case, the landlord might decide to rent to, probably not to elderly people, right? Or people who already have children who are out of the house, because those people are going to stay there forever, right? What you want are young people who are going to have families and move out to the suburbs, right? Because they're not going to stay very long. You don't want them to stay long if you're a landlord in San Francisco, because the longer they stay, you're not able to increase their rent, so it becomes low. And it's true that people in San Francisco who have lived there for 20 years pay like around half of what people who just moved there now pay, because of this version of rent control. So, okay. I think that's it for this section.